Well, good evening, everyone. I assume you can all hear us okay. If you can, just type in the message with a thumbs up. We have Peter Van Zeller, our Honorary Curator, who is picking up this evening the mantle that Dave laid down with the R&R coaches prior to preservation. And Peter is going to take over and do coaches in the preservation era. That's about right, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. So I will hand over to Peter, and before his iPhone goes to sleep again, we'll let him kick off.
Right. Hopefully the technology will stick with us. We're going to have a little break after about, I can't remember what it was, 40 odd, and then show some more. We've got to dial them into the system. Anyway, we're going to look at things. I'll put the initial screen up to say, well, we've got all these preserved vehicles. They were preserving them back in 1915. And the interesting thing then was they were big railway, little railway, running a real service right through the year, Christmas Day included, 7 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night sometimes. So the little unclosed coaches were absolutely a boon. The one that didn't appear in your last sequence was actually the one shot of travelling inside a Hayward carriage. So if you're not too wide, it's actually quite comfortable, sat side by side, whether you could put your tall hat on, but you could certainly sit and get in and out. And the bars on the window were actually because this vehicle travelled up and down the line at Duffield Bank before it came to Ravenglass, and you wouldn't have got your head out through the tunnels, or you wouldn't have got it out and cleared the tunnels without the bars on the window. Anyway, going through, one of the interesting things for me is, of course, the open coaches took over completely, whether it was in the early days with the four-wheelers or the bogie coaches that followed them in the late 1920s and early 30s. Obviously, that's when people came to travel because it was a nice day and the railway needed to carry as many as possible. And that procedure carried on right the way through until relatively early modern times. The interesting thing was, to me again, how the opens survived and the saloons didn't. I mean, this machine was new, built in the Ravenglass shops on the top of what was a Duffield Bank, not quite finished job. It was obviously in use, active use, until the war. They were running the market day trade at the weekends, every week on Thursdays, up until the spring just before the war. It closed down passenger operations in early September 39, and this might have run about a bit, but it didn't do a great deal. It's obviously in a terrible state, but it got into a greater terrible state very quickly. And the railway was dependent on opens. To me, interesting that they never made any effort to either keep them, look after them, continue them, or whatever. So completely dependent on opens, even though when the chassis for what would then become Sheila of Eskdale was under construction, there were feelers put out to the Romney Hythe to find out whether there were any extra coaches that might be spare, whether they could make another setup of covered coaches for their new diesel. And with that in the background, when the Preservation Society bought up the line in 1960, I've cropped this picture to emphasize Colin Gilbert on the left-hand side because he was the money man, and yet he had ideas about where money should be spent, and obviously by default, ideas of where money needn't be spent. And funnily enough, open coaches were the thing, and covered coaches weren't. So Douglas was able, as general manager in his first year, to try and do his best. This is a shunting manoeuvre. There's Mr. Tebb on, I think, an Austrian rail bike, multi-gauge rail bike, which will shortly come to the Rill Miniature Railway because its builder and owner, Dr. Fischel, sadly passed away about 12 months ago. Anyway, shunting, one of the Little Reds, the conversions of the four-wheeled 1923 Dawson coaches that came to the line, let's say from Barrow, 1923, built substantially of hardwood and survived whatever was thrown at them. With Royal Anchor here, early picture, early 19, I don't know what, 63, 64, probably doing the first weed killing trains. But a very useful vehicle, and it became even more useful when you had a train of them. So much so that they even augmented it with Bunny, the ICL #1, with its engine removed. It was probably too thirsty a beast to afford to feed petrol into as a locomotive, but it was certainly extra accommodation on wet days, and later then became the caboose, the track gang's vehicle for having your meals or taking protection when you're working on the line in winter. Trevor and I will remember days of cards where we didn't play very well, but that and the little black van, which was converted out of one of those coaches, were our regular haunt before the later yellow van. There you see on the left-hand side a very short-lived device, the time clock that was fitted, one here, one at Merthwaite, one at the water tank. And the idea was that in those days, trains ran in multiple sections. There would be an engine followed a few minutes, 10 minutes officially, but did everybody have watches, by another portion if the first portion was full. And the object of the exercise was to put your time passing the clock, and then the second one would have to wait until the appropriate time had passed. Meanwhile, of course, it was losing time. So those very, very rapidly dropped out of use. Now, I mentioned Mr. Gilbert's obvious keen financial interest in the railway. Obviously, he put more money into it than he actually thought he ought to. And one of the things that they put money into was the enormous, and personally put money into, was the cutting at what is now Gilbert's, cutting off the sharp successive bends at Olling Head. My first visit to the railway, it rings in my ears even now, the squealing of wheels going around the outside. So the object of the exercise was to make an even, less sharp, less wearing curve for the vehicles to go round, not just the engines, but all the vehicles, because in those days, the amount of wear and tear on wheels was quite significant. And in the books over the years, the number of wheels that had to be put in every year compared to nowadays is quite remarkable. It could have been, I would think, if they'd have altered what rails they were using around the outside, because they had a peculiar thing of using big rails on the outside and small rails on the inside. So you had a 40-pounder on one side and a 25-pound on the other to give a bit of cant. Well, even section rails both sides might have made a considerable difference. This also shows one of the issues where they transferred the workshops from Merthwaite to Ravenglass, put it in what was the old carriage shed. Douglas is standing there next to it. And what that did in 1961 was stop the arrangement for storing all the carriages through the winter under cover as far as possible. So then they started living outside, even when the carriage sidings were put in, until the carriage shed was up in 1967. Carriages stayed outside. So there were all sorts of underlying issues, which are quite interesting. Douglas, in inverted commas, did his best. So scrounging, they managed to acquire coaches that had been on the Jaywick Railway in Essex, then at the the little railway at New Brighton. Tommy Mann's Express it was. This is an 18-inch gauge line, a most precarious steamer, and the alternative steamer was quite an attractive-looking Sentinel. And these three vehicles behind came up for grabs in the early 1960s and were grabbed to Ravenglass, including the diesel. The diesel was never re-gauged, but the coaches soon were. It was a good volunteer job. There's members of the West Yorkshire group. Colin Robb, I think, with his back to us in the middle of the picture. Colin Robinson, who later worked on the line, lives locally still. Here they are being done up for repainting. And they really were quite a smart set in my early memories of them. Interiors were getting a bit musty, but never mind. They were upholstered and there was space to stretch your legs out. In fact, on really wet days, the seating on the cover was augmented by pop crates, and you squeezed in whatever you could. And one of the little reds looking very tidy on the end of the train there. They were a godsend. They were just what Royal Anchor needed when it was on its morning duties. There was an overnight train in those days which went up to Dalegarth, stopped overnight and came down first thing in the morning, bringing the staff. And when I got involved with the railway about 1968, they started running a morning train, a 9 o'clock-ish, and that went round the system. Royal Anchor would probably just about pull this set without undue issues. More to the point, Royal Anchor could stop this set without undue issues because its braking was interesting. Let's put it that way. You jigged it into reverse gradually. There's a hydraulic system, and if you jigged it too much, i.e. in emergency, oh my God, pull the handle back, you were inclined to burst the pipes. You can see the transmission pipes below the buffers. And even if one of them leaked or burst, that was it. You got no control at all. You were actually skidding on an oil slick that was developing out of the 45 gallons of oil in the sump. And you might stop in about 3/4 of a mile. And certainly to stop for Graham Withers at Fisher Ground Halt in the morning to pick him up, you had to start thinking about it. I mean, thinking about it at Spout House. You know, otherwise you stood no chance. And he was very good at getting on at speed. But bizarrely for me, I mean, I after my first season here, I went down and visited a little railway at Fairbourne. My goodness, was it an eye-opener? They got shelter for the rolling stock. I mean, it's a bit, you know, looking at it, utilitarian, but nevertheless, it was shelter. And they got these covered coaches. Very smart, sat inside, doors that opened, doors looking, pivoting, sliding on the outside so you didn't bang yourselves. You know, somebody, John Wilkins, made his money out of washing machines, could afford to do these things as a personal thing. And, you know, he did it right for the Fairbourne. Whereas, bless Colin Gilbert, given his background, his interests and all the rest of it, one kind of thinks he might have done it differently. Let's put it that way. The cutting would have paid for a trainload of covered coaches. Anyway, not to be outdone, once, and it would appear to me, once Colin Gilbert was seriously ill and not actively involved in what was going on, the Society's director and Douglas were seriously getting together and money started to get spent. Carriage shed, new coaches. There was a new open built by a company that actually had a background in all sorts of vehicles. Myers and Bowman. They made all sorts of odd vehicles in the district, and they were ideally placed to make our first new carriages for many, many years. And give these guys credit. That was 19 67 or winter 66, 67 at this point. They were delivered in the spring of. Aluminium bodied, quite evolutionary at the time. It did bring on slight problems later with the interaction between the aluminium and the steel mainframes. But then the big railway rail cars and Mr. Land Rover all had that sort of problem. But here they are into construction. The seat units, Dickie Roddy and I will know and love them well, because whenever they started wobbling, you've got to try and think of a way of stopping them wobbling, and all sorts of bodgery went on, and those seats on the whole are still supporting bodies. They're there, nicely matched with Royal Anchor, new, outside the cafe at Ravenglass. Now, looked end ways on, just notice on the left-hand end, next to the little white van, you'll see the coupling. There's a coupling story to be told. It's probably safe now. For whatever reason, they had fastened ordinary wagon couplings on the end of the coaches, because it's simple and straightforward. 2 holes, bang, go them up, ding, ding, ding. And it worked. It did work beautifully for nearly 12 months. And obviously there's background to it, because the big bogey hoppers had couplings like that fastened on the end. They'd gone down to Romney, nobody complained. And whoops-a-daisy. Anyway, it was, as I say, nearly 12 months after delivery when River Esk set off from Ravenglass, roughly this sort of formation, in late April. I was actually at the railway at the time, not on the train, thank the Lord, because coming back down the line, just above Fisher Ground, where the advanced signal for the water for the points is now, water tank corner, they developed a kink in the track. In those days, the track was steadily being relaid, but there were long sections which have been in since 1920 or something, and all the joints were rusted up solid. So at different places where you did track work, kinks developed because bits of track didn't move against other bits of track. Coming round there, the train divided, and at Eskdale Green Station, Dawn Pereira was on the platform waiting. When first River Esk came through, it didn't stop because it only had a short train. It was going like the Dickens. And shortly afterwards, the second portion rolled through. The guard, bless him, David Bell, was in the first coach talking to a passenger. The back half was unconnected, uncontrolled, and they stayed ahead of it until the Chicken Run corner, where it all neatly joined up. I'm afraid this isn't actually the correct headline, because we were on page 4 of the Daily Mail that week, but with a steam issue. And very, very rapidly afterwards came the couplings that you and I know and probably have cursed over our years. They were devised very, very quickly and fitted with plenty of room on the outside, and the springs on the inside you pulled on something more solid and then cushion on. These are the later couplings actually fitted to our Maxi coaches, but of the same principle. Now, there were 2 of these vehicles at the start, but then further ones came from a competing organisation, Edmund Crowe, and Mr. Crowe got his prices right and came in under and delivered coaches that were more or less equal to the first M&Bs. He carried on building for us for another 20 odd years, and even built one for the Western Railway at the back there. They're fairly simple to look at. The difference with the Crowe coach was that on the left-hand end here, the what should we say, the folding doors, again, that most of us will have cursed in our time, were fitted, whereas on the first 2 M&Bs, there were outward opening, flapping doors. So one lesson had been learned after a couple of years, that outward opening hinged doors potentially don't stay hinged locked all the time. With all these coaches, one of the slight disappointments was actually the window size. Of course, this was helped, shall we say, controlled by what you could buy, caravan windows and that sort of thing. There were louvered windows there on each compartment, which could be opened to induce draft in warm weather. Whether it was strictly necessary, I would actually doubt, but they were part of the system. But you will find, if you travel on the trains, that one of the coaches with its small windows at one end actually has a big window at the other. So it's slightly out of sequence, and I don't know whether Trevor's online, but we'll tell the story anyway, because we were travelling down from Delgarth just before Christmas. It was the Friday evening of the Ravenglass Christmas dance in the village hall, all gooed up, ready to go and tread the floor. And we were travelling down, having done a hard day. I think we were up at Fisher Ground. I was sat with my back to this end, travelling. Opposite me was Trevor and Martin. And Graham was driving. He'd just come back to the railway at this point. Suddenly, in the dark, at I don't know what miles an hour, Martin got out without a word. And I was looking at this when Trevor followed him. And then we hit the tree. We were embedded in quite a large tree, and we were equipped with one blunt, very blunt bushman saw. No means of communicating to Ravenglass. It was weeing it down, so it was just a question of do your best, lads. Nobody knew where we were, what we were doing, or what. This is how the railway was 40-something years ago. And number 107, as it is now, bears the tales to tell. But anyway, the Crow coaches came, and one of them was actually set up as a guards van. So it had a little ducket where you could peer through the end windows and look down your train, or easily open the window, open the door and stick your head out. There's the guard of the time, David Bell, bless him, taking tickets, and the simple transfer R and ER on the side. But underneath the coaches was something relatively special, because these coaches were cumulatively getting quite heavy, particularly if you had to drag the Jaywick coaches around on plain bearings. So this bogie design came out of David Kerwin. Actually, in our archives, it's down as the David Kerwin bogie, although in R&ER operating terms, it's regarded as the Seven Lamb, and quite rudimentary, but it works. The only thing it was short of was secondary suspension. You got the springs on the bearings, but nothing on the top, so that there was a limit on how the thing rode, and also its sensitivity to the track. But never mind, these roller bearings put on every single vehicle dramatically altered how the railway operated. And the other change that we'll see, we're going to stop in a moment and just add a few more pictures, was the use of the motif of the railway's original monograms. That's its original seal, and the document with Faithful Cooks, I think, on the other end. No, this one has the contract to build the line with the engineer. But a cousin of Barbara Cowan, who worked in the office, was a David Williams. A Peter Williams, and Peter devised a simpler version of it to be a monogram, and it survived from the early 1970s to the present day. So we'll take up the story with Edmund Crowe supplying coaches, about 3 a year for year after year after year. This is slightly out of sequence, one of the later ones. Anybody who is looking at coach numbers now will see them in a particular order. It wasn't the order that they were delivered by any means, because late colleague, that's him, Martin Willey, numbered them in the sets that he would like to see them. So 101 and 102, F103 was a semi-open at the front, etc., and 108 a semi-open at the other end. And some people have said, why not alter that? Well, dear heavens, it's so complicated. It's not true. And the other interesting thing, bless him, now we've mentioned Martin, was that he knew his coaches. So there was a time when so many of them had either not been through the works and been altered, or were in original condition, had brakes, hadn't got brakes, etc., etc. And on this particular occasion, several people have been helping me at the paint shop. They'd rubbed the numbers off one coach, and I'd painted the wrong number on it. Realised when I saw its oppo was outside, thought, oh dear, or words to that effect. Oh, hang on a minute, Martin's on holiday. He's gone skiing, helping the Wyndham, as it was, school group with skiing. I wonder, the coach that's outside that's wrong, funnily enough, is exactly a dead ringer for the one that we've got the wrong number on. If I can, at which point, apparently skiing had been abandoned due to a small child getting broken. And Martin had come back several days early, walked down over the bridge and said, you've got the wrong number on that one. Another scheme bit the dust. Anyway, there we are. There we are. They all look the same, except they weren't all. They may look, what should we say, tired occasionally when they've got covered in track groom, but they've worked remarkably. Now, the later ones, I should point out, were different in construction. They had a steel framework inside the aluminium top. They were actually later on more susceptible to the corrosion between aluminium and steel. However, they led on to directly to having coaches with no windows in at all, the semi-opens, as we, oh, there we are. Thank you very much, Christopher. There were two batches of them originally. The original ones are the ones where you can actually see the steel work on the outside. They were delivered in 1971. And then later ones had the top rim covered up by a lip. It looks tidy, but it does have the capacity to grab you on the skull if you've not got a hat on. And the other thing that you might have noticed is that they've got pipes on the outside now, because at that particular time, the railway was anticipating things changing in the railway industry. Up until that time, there were no controls over the Ravenglass Eskdale Railway, because it shouldn't have been there, and it was a private railway, and etc., etc. What was coming up was the Health and Safety at Work Act, which was being drafted to include railways over 350 millimetres, which included our 15-inch gauge, under railways that came under Her Majesty's Railways Inspectorate, etc., etc., etc. Trying to preempt that, the Society put money into making its locomotive, Rivermite, capable of working air brakes. So it's got pipe working, and you can just see the, I'm sorry, it's not focused as well as it should. Just on my little screen, the air compressor, a little 2-cylinder horizontal one. For some reason, it never functioned particularly well and was actually carved up into 2 units a few years later by Arthur Bailey to make 2 smaller pumps that worked remarkably well. Why we couldn't make a cross-ported pump work when the ones at the different railways tick away beautifully, I have no idea. But the real key to all this was the guy in the cab there. It's not come out particularly well, but he was a gentleman, a volunteer called Hugh Taylor. Hugh worked in the alongside the gunnery industry. He came across to ask meals every now and again, got involved volunteering on the railway. He would like to light the fires in the morning early, and he would even cook for the volunteers. His various escapades in the oven are legendary. But the one thing he should be remembered for is working out the brake system, because at that time the people trying to advise us were thinking of having a twin pipe air brake system that wasn't fail safe. And Hugh threw his arms up in disgust and devised one that worked with various components in the single pipe Westinghouse system, fail safe like the Biggles. And he's, what should we say? My admiration for what he achieved was colossal then, it's beyond it now. This actually isn't taken at Ravenglass because other railways have taken up the idea using commercial vehicle parts. This is the bit on a lorry that if you had a trailer behind would make the trailer brakes working with the towing lorry brakes. And those things are a bit like hen's teeth now, but there's still an equivalent being produced, which is fitted to our later rolling stock, a trailer control valve. And it's the fact that it works, and it's so relatively simple and straightforward, and anybody now driving our trains has them fully under control. It was not so in the early days. If you had Royal Anchor, as I explained earlier, you would travel with, what should we say, an eye to the future, where we're going to be able to stop somewhere where we needed. It was all right if you intended to stop at, but stop in a hurry was a different thing altogether. Anyway, following the introduction of air brakes, we had various other developments on the railway involving our coaches. So what I'll do, I'll wander about a bit. This is the rail car, bless it. It was devised in 1976 to 7 to provide an overnight service that was more easy to maintain in theory, reliable, etc., than Royal Anchor that had gone before, which was promptly sold on to the railway operation at Carnforth, just to make sure that nobody got it back out of the box to help the rail car. Anyway, there's Cyril, bless him, driving, probably down the line at the look of this. One of one's messages that one will frequently hear is, okay, Cyril, we'll come and sort you out. We'll come back over the radio because Cyril was somewhere and something had happened. In those days, the bit away from us, the uphill end at Eskdale Green, was the power car. And the bit at this end is the trailer, the control trailer, the driving trailer. There were other vehicles put in between. They were later converted into ordinary coaches for various devices. This one you'll know and love because when you get to it, you'll discover that it may look like a coach, but the doors are the wrong way around. The other thing that happened around then was finally getting a diesel locomotive that could handle our trains without difficulty, named Lady Wakefield. At her naming ceremony, the Lady Wakefield herself was in a wheelchair, and it was pretty bloody obvious that something should be done to try and help people who could access our coaches. And hence we ended up with the first wheelchair accessible coaches. There's Douglas Bader inaugurating the service sometime in, when was it? I've got lost now, 81, I think. And now a wheelchair accessible coach is part of every set. It's something else. Thank you, Nigel. It bears recognition that of all the railways in the country, the RNER has had wheelchair accessible coaches. They may be primitive, etc., but they're there and they've been used and appreciated. The next stage was to have the undercovered ones. And this is the first one that was eventually going to end up as the centre car in the rail car unit to go off to the Liverpool Garden Festival. It was there to shuttle up and down from the main entrance up into the centre of the site. And it was actually going to be fundamental, as I say, for accessibility. 82, thank you very much. My daughter did the offering of flowers, so I really ought to know the date better. Yeah, it's there in its new intercity livery, and only there in intercity by the skin of its whatnot. It was due there at a certain date. It was going to be repainted by the British Rail Engineering Workshops at Crewe by the apprentices. And shortly before the due date for delivery, we discovered that they couldn't do it. They just sent the paint instead. So we had half a dozen enormous cans of paint and one picture, because there was only two other coaches on the main line in that intercity livery at the time. Thankfully, I discovered some really good masking tape that will peel off nicely and leave nice sharp edges. So Neil Glover and I and other helpers were involved in getting the thing ready against the deadline and peeling the lines off. I got wrong from Douglas because he said that the lines were the wrong distance apart. Luckily, by this stage, we painted enough of them that there was no going back. But he did admit later that actually we were nearly right. What else happened? Oh, while we were painting them in a hurry, I might have said this before, we were in a hurry in the any undercover accommodation in the few days before these were due to go on a lorry and be there at Liverpool. So every undercover space had a vehicle in it because we were trying to do 4 of them. And then Neil said, we've just pulled one of those connectors off. Oh, blow, we said. So we undid the screws and looked inside the connection and discovered that the 7 wires of the 7 colours were in a certain order. So we put the wires back on the screws on the one that we pulled off in that order. And we told the chief engineer at the time and got a grimace. And then he went out trying to do his test runs on the Monday morning and blew different relays because the front end wanted to go one way and the back end wanted to go another, and the engine stop wouldn't do. We weren't in good grace. We weren't even in good grace later because he came along and said, well, show me what you've done. And I had his wiring diagram and I said, well, red's on number 1, and ran the colours, and what we put on was according to the wiring diagram. So somebody somewhere hadn't wired it according to the wiring diagram. More to the point, from one end to the other, it had a spiral in the wiring that was a bit like your DNA spiral. And let's put it this way, if your DNA spiral can have so many combinations, it's not true. In 4 carriages with a DNA equivalent spiral on 7 wires, you can have an awful lot of combinations to work out where you have gone wrong. Let's leave it at that. Anyway, more issues on the Ravenglass came with other changes to the carriages. We'll divert off the rail car for this moment. Santa trains. Well, we started running Santa trains. They're incredibly popular, but people like to keep warm in the carriages. So what did the railway do? We fitted little gas heaters in each of the carriages. We connected them together between the carriages with a rubber pipe and a Jubilee clip. And at one end, in a semi-open carriage, we had an enormous gas bottle. And this worked beautifully. It heated the carriages. And when you came at night, you switched it off at the gas bottle. However, if you weren't careful when you were lighting them the following day, and I think it was a Mr. Pickup who was a little slow doing it, because the gas taps on the gas heaters hadn't been turned off, they were leaking until you lit them. And apparently the last coach had just got the right gas air mixture when the ignition took place. And I don't know whether eyebrows were involved, but curses certainly were. Anyway, where are we up to? There is the feature that just sits there on the side of the carriages, the replacement. You've got a fuel inlet tap to a fuel tank under a seat, and an EBA spasher, which is a lorry heating, cab heating unit, so the lorries that drive our roads can sit in a lay-by overnight and keep the drivers warm in their cozy little cabs with this heater using the fuel out of the tank. And underneath, a charging point. It looks very simple. It's quite innocuous, but my goodness, does it make life different. Once one has overcome the issues between the different modes of operation on these electronic gadgets that make them work, it does require a certain degree of charge. Anyway, we'll get on in years. We're now up to 1989, and there's a year of interest on the railway with new coaches, one of them belonging to us and one of them not belonging to us. The big red one was the spare carriage from the the prototype carriage for the railway that was then in shape of being built at the Bure Valley in Norfolk. And very sensibly, they worked out, we're going to build a lot of these, let's see what they're like. And so they made a simple structure, steel, covered with steel, panelled out inside, not, I was going to say at some point, quite luxurious. I think there were buttoned leather seats on the later build ones, but they've been remarkably durable. I think they've had to have new roofs, again, illustrating how the R&ER coaches have actually proved even more durable. I find when I'm in them, the ends where they've got a window are better, when you can see a little bit out of all the angles of the vehicle. But they've done remarkably well. It was much appreciated here, but it did have the issue of these outward opening hinge doors. And then the other one, the Maxi, as it was then. This was the prototype built by the Smiths brothers in Workington, Ian Smith's family. And it was reputedly shaped on a Campbelltown and Machrihanish exterior. The seat layout we actually played with in the office, where we had lots of ordinary office type chairs and spaced them apart and had people sitting on them and trying to get what the minimum elbow room and maximum leg room you could get in. Anyway, one way and another, it worked. And we ended up with a vehicle that was, this is obviously a little primitive at the time, but this was to get the thing rolling and see whether it worked. The idea was to provide more of them for the Gateshead Garden Festival that was in Offing, but you could see how useful it will be for Santa. Well, Smith Brothers unfortunately didn't get the contract to build the sequence that were required for the Garden Festival, and they were produced at Carnforth, at the workshops that are now West Coast Railways. But the vehicles were all ready to go to the Gateshead Garden Festival and perform beautifully. The actual service ones had two doors at either end because it was thought the single door in the sector wasn't going to load and unload fast enough at the stations. And you can see behind the other coaches that were variously either left over from the Liverpool Garden Festival or built new. And there with Northern Rock at the Gateshead Garden Festival, another sequence. They came back to Ravenglass and they became Bonnie Dundee's set. And they fitted, they provided a combination of rather open air end seats and undercover seats, but they had a remarkable ability to fill up every seat without issues. When you have our normal saloon coaches, then when you had two people in a compartment or even one person in a compartment, there was a reluctance to share. And quite naturally, with these coaches, with individual seats inside, they individually filled up without any issues. And the upshot was that little Bonnie Dundee, with 6 of these, could carry as many passengers, as many bums on seats as bigger engines with 10 coaches possibly. I put a few in because this is one of its great days, which was the ceremony of completing the relaying of the track with the celebration of River Earth's centenary, I don't know that, yes, and a bit in 1994. And there's Sir Peter Heywood, the current Heywood, nailing in the golden spike. I don't think it was golden for very long. And the other interest, of course, is where the people making the speeches are standing. The yakking wagon, a vehicle that has disappeared off the firmament at the moment. It was a balustrade that could be fitted to the boiler flat, and the powers that be would stand on and make their speeches. It was a day that was remarkable for sartorial elegance, and George enjoyed, thank you, Christopher. George enjoyed every bloody minute of it, even had his trousers the right length. There's another sartorial elegant guard and official dog. Anyway, to bring the story slowly to a conclusion, we end up with the conversion of some of these vehicles into something else. The Ian Smith brothers vehicle, the original prototype, became the Bell, and many happy occasions took place inside it. Another vehicle became the Guards coach, and decorated here, sponsored by Sellafield, and later the Rat coach. And they were, what should we say, quite comfortable at their time. Sadly, though, for all that running about with Martin's extra capacity of water, they became involved just after Bonnie Dundee was withdrawn for boiler work in a couple of derailments. It was our, what should we say, our chance to have something like that happen within about 3 or 4 weeks of the Rail Accident Investigation Branch being established and given powers. So they came to Ravenglass with a blank sheet and a set of procedures that they needed to practice, and they did practice. One of the slight issues was that by the time they came to look, actually the track round the funding place had been sorted out because you just do that in the course of sorting. And so there was no actual evidence as to why the coach had lifted a wheel at the wrong moment when it was completely empty. So the coach in question was a Maxi, but there were 2 derailments. One following a few weeks later was actually an ordinary coach, and this completely threw the Rail Accident Investigation team. It was all very interesting. And the next thing they demanded was that there should have been a mandatory inspection regime. And so the mandatory inspection regime involved lots of tick boxes that had to be done for every inspection. Well, the winter inspections had actually been done on these vehicles when the information came through that the tick box scheme had to be authorised by somebody and then carried through. So poor Martin was involved with a very strict deadline of there's a Thomas weekend is coming, in lifting all these particular carriages, lifting every damn carriage on the railway and putting it through a regime that involved measuring tyre profile, wheel profile, brake clearances, brake application, etc., and then put them all back together. And sadly, one item had been slightly dislocated, and on this occasion, a compensating bar fell off at a particular point. So these ended up with very much a sour taste. And although they were capable, competent vehicles, they ended up in the engineers, and 3 survivors ended up there with poor Bonnie Dundee awaiting attention that would only come many years later. One of them ended, of course, as the online shop. Sadly, though, in my view, because of what comes next, nobody took any notice of what had happened when River Mite and Northern Rock had gone to Dresden. They had been invited there, I think it was 98. It was a great weekend of running trains. Northern Rock was limited on going around the whole site. River Mite went round and round like Billy-O. And what was interesting was that some of the coaches were provided from England, and they had plug lock doors that swung aside a bit like the back of your car if you've got a SUV. And they've been provided by Winson's, the company that had done a lot of work for the Muir Valley at different times. They seem to work beautifully, and they were worth replicating because you ended up with a door that could be closed without getting in people's way as an interior slider, and it wouldn't flap open if the train was going along. Anyway, not in direct connection was the travel that this particular coach, the most travelled of all our vehicles physically, it went to Boston Lodge briefly. It didn't do anything much there except get being looked at. And looked at it was with regard to building the next generation of R&R coaches. They created a mock-up for bums on seats, elbows, height, windows, etc., etc. Norman Bond of the carriage man of the time did this mock-up, and then his successors managed to turn it into reality. The coaches had an investment of quite a lot of thought gone into them, particularly that the construction should not involve the corrosion that we've experienced on our ordinary coaches. They've got steel internal bodywork, but stainless steel. And with the aluminium panels on the outside, you should have an indefinite life. And this is one of the vehicles. They were aiming to give the look and finish of their own prestigious vehicles. This is a Pullman, and this was the Ravenglass version. The only slight issues we've had with it is your varifocal lenses might get varifocal in another dimension through the curved glass on the end. But hang on, they've arrived at Ravenglass, different liveries. The Pullman version copied the Lancashire and Yorkshire Pullman livery that the Fastiniog had, and the maroon coaches followed the preference for maroon coaches on the Ravenglass. And here we are with a bunch of, I don't know what you could call, lovely ladies in there. Of course, whether they become the standard coach for the future, who knows? Because the coaches that they're supplementing have lasted many, many years and provide very reasonable accommodation when they're done up compared to the newer coaches, with the proviso that the door doesn't swing open. And somebody did comment, if we'd had a full set of these, we might be challenged to keep them. However, they are lovely, and it does bear thinking about that what we've got actually has done remarkably well. This particular vehicle, you can see above the lady's head, what was going to be a passenger information or warning device, have been to summon problems. It was eventually decided that if you wave your arm out the window, that was sufficient warning. But the work inside these coaches, credit ought to be to this gentleman who retired earlier this year, Richard Rothery, set to and overhauled all the coaches internally and achieved that sort of ageless canal boat finish. So thank you, Richard. Your work will carry on beyond years to come.
Well, that's very interesting, Peter. Thank you for doing that. We'll see. We've probably seen some of the comments as we've been going along, but we'll have a look and see what's there.
Do I have to get rid of something?
Well, I'd leave that up and then it's
what?
Leave the picture up.
Oh, leave the
don't
picture
see us, it's, otherwise it's so Nigel could hear us, and Christopher has identified that number 117 in the early photos is now 105, the P-Way mess coach, and mess being the operative word with that vehicle. Nigel, clearly a fan of Doris in the maroon and creamy grey livery, and Chrissy has identified that Douglas Bader commissioned the wheelchair coaches on the 21st of July 1982. And I think he had a footplate ride with Trevor, didn't he? I think Trevor, one of Trevor's stories is that he had a footplate ride with him, and as a result, Trevor was treated to afternoon tea with the directors, I believe. Well, I'm sure he's told us.
Collect these things, you see.
Yeah. And Mark Harrington has thought it was a in City 125. And Owen has mentioned something that was a consideration. And it still is a consideration because you do have to watch where the wheelchair coaches are. And it's also why the new coaches, it was Joan, wasn't it, when we did the test trains, sat down on the bogies a bit. And there are certain places where if it's not at the end of the platform, you can't open the doors if it's got a full load of people in it. So that is still a problem, and we have to be careful with it where they go. And Christopher's obviously been seeing whether he can cash the spike in at Cash for Gold. One question, Peter: who designed the saloon coaches, or did they just evolve?
Well, I think Douglas must have had a hand in it. I mean, the Myers and Bowman people, looking at what they produced, were obviously quite capable. But you had that. I mean, again, they built the chassis of the year before, the steel framed open, whatever number it's developed into, 166 it used to be. But, and then you sort of put a top on that. And whether there was any sort of involvement with Fairborn, because everybody was kind of friendly and talking to each other. I don't think Douglas ever claimed anything, if you like. I think they probably made quite a reasonable job, if you know what I mean. And just, it was this long, it needed to be that high, that wide.
More or less, yeah. I mean, they've stood the test of time.
Well, sorry, when you look at everybody else's stuff, bless them, you know, Romney have gone through a generation of those hardwood coaches, you know, that aren't surviving much longer. Festiniog have got various generations of coaches before they get to what now will probably be their, you know, the ones that go on hopefully forever. And they rebuild the old ones, but the in-betweeners, the barns or whatever they call them, they haven't particularly survived. And Tallaslyn, again, the intermediate wooden coaches of between the very ancient ones and the modern take some upkeep. I think, you know, we haven't loved them. I've spent 40 years tending to them. But with respect to what Richard did, when he settled down, and nobody really thanked him, but that canal boat finish is ageless and it's robust. You know, you knock a few corners off it, doesn't make a bloody difference. Still looks, you know, in inverted commas, appropriate. And to be candid, I was disappointed. Well, I say I was disappointed. I just missed out on getting some cheap seats to do the others of the Maxis, like what's now the blue coach.
Yes.
Because that had new seats in. I got something happened. I got a bit of money and something went adrift. I could have got, I don't know, 40 odd seats, cheap, new, and you got them in, got Richard to do his works with nice ceilings, nice surrounds. Those Maxis would have been doing the job still to this day.
Yeah.
I mean, with respect to, they were more sensitive because they were longer, and basically, if you didn't grease the rubbing points of the bogies, and one of the issues I think was some of these carriages might not have come out of Dundee season, shall we say, so they may not have got greased.
Yes.
I'm not saying that was the issue, but they were more sensitive to track. And the other thing at that time was actually there was a big engine walloping round without a speed limit on it. Douglas was running colossal mileages, but nobody was worried about its top speed. I mean, it was the reduction from 20 to 15 came as a result of the incident, but something had been disturbing the track. And I'm not saying the rail accident investigation could be disputed at all, but there are a lot of interesting situations coming together. And I'm sad for the Maxis. They could have been universally better.
Well, as Matthew Felwick said, they were a great design, and actually they were very clever. They're probably bits that could have been improved with a bit more, like the window height was a bit low and things like that. But they were a big step up, and they were probably let down by maybe some of the initial the production construction with the hogging and things like that.
Yeah, if they'd have had, what should we say? You've got the chassis had slightly lighter. This was the big difference. I was going to say the Ian Smith chassis had deeper section RSJs in. The Campus chassis had Romney depth RSJs in, and the sections that took them above the bogies weren't as robust as they could have been. If they'd have had something extra in there, because the other issue was that, how can I put it? When they used to get shunted away at night, they would be buffered in against the stops, which I don't think actually
sort of compressed
did them an awful lot of good. It's all history.
But and I can remember riding in Gardington. They were very different, and they filled up in the way you said as well, in a way that even post-COVID, we get this where we should be forcing people into carriages and things like that. But actually, there isn't space to do it. Modern people are bigger, not fatter, but the average human is bigger than they were when the blue and white coaches were first in traffic. And you just can't get, if you've got people over 6 foot, they just don't fit now. So the new coaches, Boston Lodge coaches, are showing the way. They might not be perfect. They are prototypes, as we tell people. But what they have done is certainly raised the standard of finish in particularly interiors. And they are, when you're riding them, they are lovely to ride in. And it's how we move forward from that, really, isn't it? But yes. Bob Douglas was Trevor's guard on the inaugural disability coach train with Biggles Father. So yes,
Right.
people are still around. It's not that long ago.
Well, I was actually trying to find a picture of my daughter giving the flowers out, and she was only 5 or something at the time. So failed there.
And of course, the other thing we should remember is one of our current disabled saloons. Can't remember. It's the one with the millions of rivets in. That was built later, wasn't it, in the workshop here as a project?
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
one of
The volunteer
138
job.
or whatever
Yeah.
number it is.
Yeah.
Is much later than
So the design actually has lived a long time. That's excellent. Well, that was really interesting, Peter. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you.
I don't know. We might be back in November. Is it November?
David's
November.
And we don't know what it'll be. But keep your eyes peeled on Facebook. We will definitely come up with something. But thank you all for watching. I am going to disappear fairly quickly this evening so that I don't get stranded in Ravenglass as the road shuts soon. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Bye for now.
And I've got to work out. Oh, there it is. End.